As I stood in the warm, gentle rain looking down at the grave, I took a moment to reflect on the various and curious connections that brought me to this place. Earlier in the year, I joined the team at Hanbury Hall, Worcestershire, UK, as a volunteer gardener. The role has covered a multitude of jobs. From lawn edging, to pulling and planting bulbs, flowers, and vegetables. And weeding. Lots of weeding. A significant activity is the cutting of the box hedging and bay trees in the parterre and formal fruit gardens, both of which are cut by hand, with shears, and all took a while to cut to the satisfaction of the senior gardeners. The phrase, "you're nearly there," still rings in my ears. The parterre in its current form was re-established in 1996 using the original plans created by George London, when the house was first built in 1706. Visitor comments received whilst working in the garden certainly praise the efforts of the gardeners. It was back in the late 1780s that Cecil and Emma Vernon cleared the formal gardens and replaced them with the trend for less formality, in the style of Capability Brown. There is a family connection to Capability Brown, but it is not listed as one of his designs. Also new to Hanbury Church is curate William Sneyd. He graduated from St. John's College, Cambridge. Cecil Vernon, it appears, took more interest in the gardens than with his wife. Shortly after William's arrival, Emma and William started an affair. The couple hatched a plan to elope and they both left Hanbury Hall. William spent a short period of incarceration in Marshalsea Prison, the notorious prison in Southwark, London. Released only when Emma paid the £1,000 fine imposed as damages in the case brought up in court by Cecil. It is probable that William caught tuberculosis whilst in prison. In an effort to improve William's health, the couple travelled overseas to Lisbon, Portugal. Their time in Lisbon was short-lived as William died in August 1793 from his tuberculosis, aged just 37. Emma returned to England and remarried. Emma lived until 1818 and was buried in Hanbury. As she had no heirs, the house was handed to other lines in the family and generally ignored for many years. In 1963, the National Trust acquired the house and land. At this point, my curiosity in the life of Emma and William would have stopped. However, I had a cruise with Cunard booked for the Iberian coast, including a stopover in Lisbon. That rekindled my curiosity in what happened to William Sneyd. It was likely that William would have been buried in Lisbon. There are at least 7 cemeteries in Lisbon, so I had little hope of finding his grave. This is the point at which the mostly friendly British-Portuguese relations turned up a remarkable find. Back in 1654, Oliver Cromwell negotiated a treaty with King João IV of Portugal to include a suitable plot of land for the burial of their dead. Due to objections from the Portuguese Inquisition, it was not actually built until 1717. It was primarily for British and Dutch nationals, but is the resting place of many non-Catholics. There were a few restrictions on its construction, such as the planting of tall trees on the boundary, so the locals would not suffer the sight of the heretics' burial ground. The British cemetery is known locally as the Cemiterio dos Ingleses. The British Cemetery website has a lot of very useful information, including a contact email address and suggested donations for burial research. I sent a speculative email to the contact with what information I had. Shortly I had a most promising reply from John Peed, an honorary historian at the cemetery. John confirmed that William Sneyd was buried in the cemetery. In fact, John had recently completed a 4-year survey of the cemetery. So not only knew William was buried there, but John had copies of the inscription and photographs of the grave. As John knew I was visiting, he suggested we meet and he could give me a tour of the cemetery, including, of course, William's grave. John suggested that if I wanted to make a donation, then to bring it along with me. Handing over an envelope, in a secluded meeting place, especially a cemetery, in Lisbon sounded like something straight out of a Lisbon World War II spy novel. Arrangements were made to visit on the Monday at just before noon with appropriate code phrases. The journey to Lisbon from Southampton was a tale in itself. We sailed through the remnants of a storm that left in its wake an 8-meter swell. I took to my bed for most of the day because of seasickness. We arrived in the morning in a slightly damp Lisbon with a sky threatening rain, with brollies and coats at the ready. As the crow flies, it is about 3 kilometers from the cruise port to the cemetery. The streets and alleyways of Lisbon are far more winding and meandering, so the final walk was about twice as long. It was a pleasant walk along the promenade through Praça do Comércio, Time Out Market, Jardim Dom Luís, Green Street, Avenue Dom Carlos, Jardim das Francesinhas, stopping for a coffee in Jardim da Estrela. Apologies for the poor pronunciation. An alternative is to catch the famous 28E tram and alight at the Basilica da Estrela, which is a short walk to the cemetery. Another option would be to take one of the many electric tuk-tuks that have overrun the city. As we walked up the Ria da São Jorge, we saw a figure waiting by the gate. The phrases, "The raven rises at dawn," the reply, "The dove has already flown," were exchanged. With identities verified, John took us inside the walled cemetery and started the tour. At this point, I must really offer my heartfelt thanks to John for his knowledge, enthusiasm, and preparation. The tour included some of the history of the cemetery and notable graves. The most prominent being that of novelist Henry Fielding. If you are familiar with Catholic cemeteries with their tombstones of mainly white marble with iconic statues and engraved mausoleums, then the British cemetery has the look of a groved garden, with trees interspersing the graves and gravelled pathways being lined with, of all things, box hedging. The area we were in at that point had recently been cleared with a new planting scheme that both gave their own gardeners some relief from maintenance, and the impact climate change was having. It seems that box is not only having issues at Hanbury Hall with threats of box blight and more recently box moth, but the box hedging in the British cemetery was also under strain from drought. Also in that area was the tomb of William Sneyd. I'd made it. I have no family connection to the Sneyds or the Vernons, but at that moment in time, I felt a connection to both. Emma and William's love for each other had altered both of their lives so much. Being there with Tina, my wife, made it a poignant moment. It was at that point that the rain started and a little bit of British weather descended on a quiet spot in a British cemetery in Lisbon. John continued the tour, pausing at some rather unusual graves, of which I'll leave John to show to those who ever get the chance to visit. We passed through the MOD and Commonwealth War graves, and went into the church. It was quite beautiful with an ornate altar and sanctuary. Not quite as ostentatious as the Basilica da Estrela or the Igreja de Santa Catarina, but well worth the visit. Especially John's retelling of the story behind the memorial to the SS Romania, with its colonial inferences. We then proceeded to the parish rooms, where he showed the output of his 4-year survey of the cemetery, and the burial registry entry for William Sneyd. Our tour was complete. And again, I can only thank John Peed for his time, knowledge, and enthusiasm. I left him a copy of the National Trust Guidebook to Hanbury Hall, while he gave me a copy of the tour with additional information being sent on, including details of the Sneyd family tree. On returning to the UK, I visited the grave of Emma Vernon at Hanbury Church. As noted on the headstone, at her request, she is not buried in the family vault, but rather in the graveyard. I wondered if the similarity of the base of Emma's grave reflected that of William's. I hope this tale of a scandal, and 2 graves separated by 1,000 miles has been of interest. Further information on Hanbury Hall, the scandal of Emma Vernon and William Sneyd, and the British Cemetery in Lisbon can all be found online. For tours of the British Cemetery in Lisbon, look at the cemetery website.